My family kicked my 5-year-old daughter and me out during Christmas dinner. You should leave and never return, my sister said. Christmas is so much better without you, my mother added. I did not beg. I just said then, you will not mind me doing this. 5 minutes later, they were begging me to undo it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Maya, 33 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Growing up in our neighborhood meant projecting a perfect image to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary, in a prison of expectations I could never quite meet. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight-A grades and joined honor societies. Yet I was always overshadowed by my older sister Vanessa. She was the golden child. She could do no wrong. I was expected to be the workhorse, the one who silently provided, while Vanessa received all the praise and financial support. But I never expected that toxic dynamic to peak with my 5-year-old daughter Zuri, standing in a puddle of spilled apple cider trembling, while her own grandmother glared at her like she was a stray dog that had just wandered into a luxury boutique. "Watch what you are doing, you clumsy little brat." Vanessa's voice sliced through the warm, cinnamon-scented air of the dining room. It was Christmas Eve. The dining table was bowing under the weight of a holiday spread I had been preparing since 4 in the morning. I had made candied yams, collard greens, simmering with smoked turkey wings, an immaculate 3-cheese baked macaroni, and a beautifully roasted crown of pork. I had paid for every single ingredient out of my own pocket. I spent hours making sure everything was perfect, so my family could have a beautiful holiday. Yet the moment my daughter tipped over her plastic cup, sending a splash of cider onto the toe of Trent's pristine suede shoes, the feast was instantly forgotten. Trent is Vanessa's 38-year-old white husband. He fancied himself a wealthy real estate investor and always looked down on me. He dramatically shoved his chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, staring down at the tiny amber droplet on his expensive shoe. "Jesus," Maya Trent muttered. He grabbed a linen napkin, one I had spent time hand-washing and pressing, and aggressively dabbed at his foot. "Can you not control your kid for one evening? These are custom-made shoes. They cost more than your monthly rent." Zuri burst into tears. Her tiny hands flew to cover her face. She instinctively backed away, bumping into my legs. I immediately dropped the heavy silver serving spoon I was holding, pulling her safely behind me. The protective fire in my chest flared instantly. My heart pounded against my ribs as I looked at the man belittling my child. "She is 5 years old, Trent," I said. My voice was dangerously calm. "It was an accident." I pulled a gentle baby wipe from my pocket and knelt down next to him. "Let me see the shoe. It is just apple cider. It will wipe right off without leaving a single stain." "Do not touch it," Vanessa snapped. She slammed her crystal wine glass down onto the table so hard the fragile stem nearly shattered. She leaned across the table, her face contorted with pure, unadulterated entitlement. "It is not just cider, Maya. It is disrespect." But then again, what can we expect from a fatherless child who does not have a man in the house to teach her discipline and manners? The room went dead silent, the kind of heavy silence that rings in your ears and suffocates you. The clinking of silverware stopped. The soft holiday music playing in the background suddenly sounded like a funeral march. I stood up slowly. I made sure Zuri was tucked securely behind my legs. "Excuse me, what did you just say to my daughter?" I looked at my mother, Brenda. I desperately expected her to intervene. After all, she was a respected deaconess at our local church. She preached grace, forgiveness, and family unity every single Sunday to anyone who would listen. I waited for her to scold Vanessa. I waited for her to protect her youngest granddaughter from such a cruel and baseless attack. But Brenda did not look at Vanessa. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Her mouth was pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Her eyes held no warmth, only sharp annoyance. Instead of intervening, my own parents were glaring at me. "Now, Maya, do not start your drama tonight," my mother warned. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me across the table. "Vanessa is right. Zuri is much too wild for a formal setting. Trent is preparing to announce a massive business venture tonight, and you are completely ruining the atmosphere with your lack of parenting. Why did you even let her bring a cup to the formal dinner table in the first place? You know how much this evening means to your brother-in-law." The sheer injustice of her words paralyzed me. I stood there holding the hand of my crying 5-year-old daughter, realizing that in this house, we would always be the villains. I looked over at my father, Calvin, hoping for a shred of support. He was busy cutting his meat, avoiding my eyes entirely. The message was clear. I was expected to swallow the insult, silence my crying child, and apologize for existing. The suffocating weight of my childhood rushed back, reminding me why I had built a fortress around my own life. But looking down at Zuri's tear-stained cheeks, I knew the cycle had to end right here, right now. I squeezed Zuri's small hand and took a deep breath. "Mom, you cannot possibly blame a 5-year-old for a simple accident," I said, keeping my voice steady, despite the rage bubbling inside me. "It was just a few drops of apple cider." But my mother just shook her head, her expression hardening even more. "You always make excuses for her," Brenda replied sharply. "You never teach her boundaries. Trent works incredibly hard to provide for this family and to bring us all together for this important evening. The least you could do is make sure your child behaves properly at a formal dinner." Her words felt like a physical blow. Provide for this family. The phrase echoed in my mind, dripping with irony. My mother was completely ignoring the reality of the situation just to coddle her wealthy son-in-law. I looked around the dining room, my eyes sweeping over the massive spread of food covering the table. The golden brown fried chicken that I had carefully battered and fried to perfection. The baked macaroni and cheese bubbling with 3 different types of expensive artisan cheeses. The collard greens that had been slow cooking since the sun came up. And the sweet potato pie resting on the counter, made from the recipe my grandmother passed down only to me. I had paid for every single ingredient on this table. I had meticulously planned the menu, gone to the grocery store, and carried heavy bags into this house all by myself. I woke up at 4 in the morning today, I said, my voice rising just enough to command the room. I stood in that hot kitchen for over 12 hours. I cooked the fried chicken. I baked the macaroni and cheese. I prepared the sweet potato pie. I did all of this so that we could have a beautiful Christmas dinner. Meanwhile, Vanessa rolled out of bed at noon, went to a Pilates class, and showed up here at 6 in the evening empty-handed. She did not even bring a bottle of wine. I pointed a finger toward my sister, who was currently busy inspecting her manicured nails, looking completely unbothered by my exhaustion. "You did absolutely nothing to contribute to this holiday, Vanessa. And yet you have the nerve to sit there eating the food I bought and cooked and scream at my daughter over a drop of juice." Vanessa scoffed and rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, please, Maya," she sneered. "Do not act like you are some kind of martyr just because you made a few side dishes. Nobody asked you to go overboard. You always do this. You try so hard to be the perfect daughter with your little domestic routines, and then you hold it over our heads. It is pathetic." My mother nodded in agreement with Vanessa, which felt like a knife twisting in my back. "Your sister is right, Maya," Brenda added. "You offered to cook. Nobody forced you to spend your own money or wake up early. You cannot use that as an excuse to let your child run wild and disrespect Trent. He is about to announce a major real estate investment that will benefit all of us. You should be grateful he even wanted to spend his Christmas Eve in this house with us." Grateful. The word hung in the air, heavy and toxic. I was supposed to be grateful that Trent, a man who consistently looked down his nose at our culture and our family, condescended to eat the food I prepared. I looked at my father, Calvin, again, but he just took a slow sip of his water, refusing to intervene. He was perfectly content to let my mother and sister tear me down as long as it kept the peace with Trent. This was the dynamic I had endured my entire life. I was the workhorse. I was the one who was expected to sacrifice my time, my money, and my dignity to keep the family running smoothly. But I was never respected. I was only tolerated. I felt a familiar lump forming in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I refused to cry in front of them. I refused to let them see how much their casual cruelty destroyed me inside. I tightened my grip on Zuri's hand. She was still sniffing quietly, hiding her face against my leg. I looked directly at my mother. You do not care about the food, Mom. You do not care about the effort I put in. All you care about is kissing up to a man who thinks he is better than all of us just because he has a fat bank account and a fancy title. How dare you speak to me that way? Brenda gasped, placing a hand over her chest in mock outrage. I am your mother. You will show me respect in this house. Respect is a two-way street, I fired back, my voice unwavering. You demand respect from me, but you allow your other daughter to verbally abuse my child. You allow your son-in-law to treat me like the hired help. I have spent my entire life trying to earn a fraction of the love and approval you freely hand over to Vanessa, and for what? So I can stand here on Christmas Eve and watch you defend a pair of shoes over your own granddaughter. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Vanessa looked absolutely furious that I was daring to challenge the established hierarchy. She opened her mouth to unleash another string of insults, but before she could speak, a slow, mocking clap echoed from the other side of the table. We all turned to look. Trent was leaning back in his chair, a smug smile plastered across his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored designer blazer and pulled out a sleek leather money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill and tossed it casually onto the center of the table, letting it flutter down to land right next to the gravy boat. Look, Maya, let us not make a federal case out of this, Trent said, his voice dripping with condescension. We all know the holidays are stressful for you. Being a single mom, balancing your little bank bookkeeping job, it is a lot of pressure. You are clearly projecting your financial frustrations onto Vanessa and your mother. Just take the money. Consider it payment for your cooking services today. I know things are probably tight for you right now. Now do us all a favor, take your kid into the living room, put on a cartoon, and let the adults talk business. I stared at the crisp $100 bill resting against the porcelain edge of the gravy boat. It was the physical manifestation of every single microaggression I had swallowed over the past 7 years since Trent officially entered our family. From the very beginning, he had made it his personal mission to remind me of my place in his twisted hierarchy. He would make sly, passive-aggressive comments about the natural texture of my hair, asking if it was professional enough for a corporate banking environment. He would joke about the working-class neighborhood I lived in, asking if I felt safe walking to my car at night without a man to protect me. He constantly referred to my career as a little bank bookkeeping job, as if I spent all my days counting loose pennies in a dusty, windowless back room. And the absolute worst part was that my parents allowed him to do it. They allowed this arrogant white man to walk into a proud black household and play the role of the benevolent overseer simply because he drove a leased sports car and threw around real estate jargon at the dinner table. They equated his whiteness and his supposed wealth with ultimate success, and they were more than happy to sacrifice my dignity to keep him comfortable. They saw him as the ultimate prize for their golden child, and nothing I ever did would measure up to his bank account. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the anger burning hot and bright in my chest. For the past 6 years, my family genuinely believed I was just a mid-level clerk shuffling papers at a local branch, making barely enough to keep the lights on. I never corrected them. I never told them that my actual official title was Regional Director of Forensic Accounting for Apex Bank. I spent my days dismantling multi-million-dollar corporate fraud schemes, tracking down hidden offshore accounts, and working directly alongside federal investigators. I commanded a team of 30 senior accountants, and I made more money in a single quarter than Vanessa and Trent had probably seen in the last 3 years combined. But I never corrected my family regarding their condescending assumptions, because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. The black tax would absolutely drain me dry. If my mother knew my actual six-figure salary, she would suddenly need her entire house remodeled from the ground up to impress her church friends. My father would suddenly need a brand new luxury truck to keep up appearances at his weekend golf club. Vanessa would expect me to fund her lavish lifestyle and pay off her credit cards under the guise of sisterly support. So I played the role of the struggling single mother. I let them think I was barely scraping by counting coupons and checking discounts because it was the only way to protect my hard-earned money and secure my daughter a safe future. But looking at that $100 bill sitting on my dinner table, next to the food I had spent my own money to buy, I realized that my silence had cost me my self-respect. I had let them walk all over me to keep the peace, but there was no peace here. I looked up from the money and met Trent right in his gaze. His blue eyes were practically gleaming with self-satisfaction. He truly believed he had just put me in my place. He thought he was the generous patriarch tossing a few worthless crumbs to the struggling relative. I then looked at my parents. They were actually nodding in approval. My father picked up his water glass and took a sip, looking at me expectantly, like I should be bowing in gratitude. "Trent is being very generous to you, Maya," my father said, his voice smooth and untroubled by the massive insult that had just occurred. "Take the money and take the child upstairs. We have important family matters to discuss tonight, and we need absolute quiet to go over the details." I did not touch the money. I did not move an inch from my spot at the head of the table. I tightened my grip on Zuri and her small, trembling hand, pulling her just a little bit closer to my side to let her know she was safe and protected. The silence stretched on, becoming thick and unbearable as everyone waited for me to comply. The smug smile on Trent and his face began to falter just a fraction when he realized I was not bending to his will. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the expensive wood creaking under his weight. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice dropping an octave so it resonated powerfully through the silent room. "And I do not want your money, Trent. I want you to respect my daughter. I want you to stop treating me like the hired help in the house I grew up in. You do not get to come into this house, insult my child, and then try to pay me off like a servant." Trent let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You try to help people, and this is the thanks you get. You are always playing the victim, Maya. It is exhausting." Vanessa slammed her hands flat on the dining table, leaning forward until her face was just inches from the roasted turkey. "God, you are so bitter and ungrateful," she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "Trent is trying to help you. He is trying to be nice to you, and you just have to be a miserable person about it. You always have to ruin everything for everyone else because you are unhappy with your own pathetic life." I did not flinch. I just stared right back at her, matching her fury with a cold, calculated calm. "I am not miserable, Vanessa," I replied smoothly without raising my voice. "I am just no longer willing to be the punching bag for your husband and his fragile ego. If that ruins your fancy dinner, then maybe you should have ordered takeout instead of relying on my pathetic life to feed you." Vanessa scoffed, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. She looked around the table, seeking validation from our parents, who were now staring at me in stunned silence. Nobody had ever spoken back to the golden child like this before. It was an unspoken rule that we all had to cater to Vanessa and her moods and tantrums. "You know what?" Vanessa said, standing up so abruptly, her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I am done playing nice with you. I am done pretending we are one big happy family when you clearly hate seeing us succeed. You want to act like you are so smart and so independent. You want to sit here and demand respect while living in your little fantasy world, acting like you own the place." She looked down at Trent, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her perfectly made-up face. Her anger had suddenly shifted into something much more malicious and calculated. She was preparing to deliver a blow she thought would completely break me and put me back in my miserable place forever. "Tell her, babe," Vanessa sneered, pointing a sharp acrylic nail directly in my direction. "Tell her what the adult business is." Tell her exactly what we are celebrating tonight and why she does not belong at this table anymore. Vanessa stood up taller, her manicured hands gripping the edge of the dining table. She looked down at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. Trent and I are buying this house, Maya. She said her words slow and deliberate, as if speaking to a slow child. We are buying this property from Mom and Dad, and we are closing the deal next week. The air completely left my lungs. I sat there frozen, my mind struggling to process the words that had just left her mouth. I looked past Vanessa and stared at my mother. Brenda refused to meet my eyes suddenly, finding the embroidered pattern on her cloth napkin incredibly fascinating. "You are selling the house?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You are selling the house that Grandpa built with his own two hands without even telling me?" Trent chuckled, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive tailored shirt. "It is just a business decision, Maya," he chimed in smoothly, taking control of the conversation. "The upkeep on this place is getting to be too much for your parents. The plumbing is outdated, the roof needs replacing, and frankly, the neighborhood is gentrifying rapidly. It is the perfect time to cash out. I offered them a very fair market price of $800,000. That is enough for them to retire comfortably and buy a luxury condo down in Florida." I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. My grandfather had poured his blood, sweat, and tears into this property. It was the only tangible piece of legacy our family had left. For years, I had been the one quietly transferring funds to my parents' accounts to make sure the property taxes were paid. I had been the one paying for the emergency plumbing repairs and the new water heater. I had kept this roof over their heads while they paraded Trent around like he was royalty. And they had negotiated its sale behind my back. "We did not tell you because we knew exactly how you would react." My mother finally spoke up, her tone incredibly defensive. "We knew you would get overly emotional and completely irrational about it. It is just bricks and wood, Maya. You hold on to things too tightly." "It is not just bricks and wood," I replied, my chest tightening with a profound sense of betrayal. "It is our family home. It is where we grew up. It is the only thing we have left of Grandpa. If you needed money or wanted to sell, why did you not come to me first? Why was I not even given the option to keep the house in the family?" Vanessa let out a sharp, ugly laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. "Give you the option," she mocked, tossing her blonde extensions over her shoulder. "Be serious, Maya. With what money? You are a single mother counting pennies from a desk job. You could not even afford the down payment on a place like this, let alone the yearly maintenance and property taxes. Trent has an actual $1 million development firm. He is successful. You are just trying to hold on to the past because you have absolutely no future of your own." I stared at my sister, realizing just how deep her delusion ran. She truly believed her own lies. She believed her husband was a financial savior while viewing me as a pathetic charity case. She had no idea who I really was, or what I was truly capable of. "And we are not keeping it in the family anyway," Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "As soon as the paperwork clears, Trent is bringing in the heavy machinery. We are tearing this old drafty place down to the foundation. We are going to build a modern luxury duplex in its place. It will be the crown jewel of his investment portfolio. Bulldozing it." The word hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. They were not just selling the house, they were erasing it entirely. They were erasing the front porch where Grandpa used to sit and tell us stories on warm summer evenings. They were erasing the kitchen where I had learned to cook my first meal. They were wiping out our entire family history so Trent could build a sterile modern box and flip it for a quick profit. "And once the new house is built," Vanessa added, leaning closer to me, her eyes glittering with undisguised malice, "you and that brat will never have the right to step foot on this property again. You are not welcome in our new home, Maya. You have always been jealous of me, and I am absolutely done allowing your toxic energy around my husband. So pack up your cheap coats, take your little girl, and get out. You should leave right now and never return." The sheer audacity of her statement was staggering. My own sister was officially kicking me out of my childhood home on Christmas Eve, right after I had cooked a massive holiday feast for her to enjoy. She was tossing me and my 5-year-old daughter out into the freezing snow, all while my parents sat there and watched in silent approval. Zuri whimpered again, burying her face deep into my sweater. I wrapped my arms around her, shielding her from the absolute ugliness of the people sitting at this table. I waited for my parents to say something. I waited for them to tell Vanessa she had gone way too far. I waited for them to remind her that it was Christmas, and that a family does not throw their own flesh and blood out into the cold night over a spilled cup of juice and a real estate deal. But instead, my father Calvin slowly set down his heavy silver fork and cleared his throat. He looked at me with a stern expression, completely devoid of paternal warmth or basic human empathy. He adjusted his glasses and prepared to defend the very people who were destroying our legacy. My father Calvin folded his hands on the table and looked at me as if I were a disappointing employee rather than his youngest daughter. "You need to calm down, Maya," he began, his voice carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority. "Vanessa is acting out of anger, but she has a point. This house is a financial burden that your mother and I can no longer carry. We are getting older and we need security. Trent is providing that security." I shook my head, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "Security?" I echoed, my voice trembling slightly before I forced it to steady. "If you needed security, why did you not come to me? Why did you not sit me down and tell me the house was becoming too much for you to handle? Why did you not offer to sell it to me so we could keep Grandfather Theodore and his legacy in the family?" My mother let out a loud, bitter scoff. She dropped her napkin onto her plate and glared at me. "Discuss it with you," she sneered, her face twisting into a mask of pure condescension. "Be realistic, Maya. Do you even have the money to buy a house like this? You are a single mother who can barely take care of herself. You are constantly penny pinching and clipping coupons just to buy groceries. We see how you live. We know you are struggling. Why on earth would we bring a massive real estate transaction to someone who works a basic desk job at a local bank branch?" Her words felt like shards of glass tearing through my chest. The absolute sheer hypocrisy of her statement was suffocating. I stared at the woman who had birthed me, the woman whose electric bill I had paid just 3 months ago, so she would not be left in the dark. I swallowed the thick knot of resentment that threatened to choke me. "I am struggling because I have been carrying the weight of this family for years," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I looked right into my mother and her eyes refusing to let her look away. "Do you remember last winter when the furnace completely broke down and you called me crying because the house was freezing? Trent and Vanessa were on a ski trip in Aspen. They ignored your calls. I was the one who drained my savings to pay the emergency heating technicians $5,000 to fix it." My mother blinked rapidly, her posture stiffening. "That was different." She deflected, waving her hand dismissively. "You are our daughter. It is your duty to help your parents when they are in need." "My duty." I repeated the word, tasting like poison. "It is my duty to pay your bills, but it is Trent and his right to profit off of our family home." I turned to my father. "What about the property taxes, Dad? 2 years ago you were going to lose this house because you fell behind on the taxes. Trent did not write you a check. Vanessa did not offer a single dime. I paid those taxes. I paid the medical bills when Mom had her knee surgery. I have spent the last 6 years quietly keeping this family afloat while you treated me like a burden. I paid the black tax every single month without complaining because I thought we were a family. And you repay me by selling Grandfather and his house to a man who openly disrespects us." My father slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. "That is enough, Maya," he shouted, his face turning red. "We are not going to sit here and listen to you recount every little favor you have ever done for us. That is what family does. We help each other. But Trent has $1 million company. He is a professional real estate developer. He understands the market and he knows how to maximize the value of this land. You are talking about a few $1,000s here and there. Trent is talking about generational wealth. Generational wealth for who? I fired back, my anger finally breaking through my carefully maintained composure. For him, not for us. He is going to knock down our history to build a duplex and pocket the profit. He is taking away the only thing grandfather left us. Trent leaned back in his chair, a look of absolute triumph resting on his pale face. He was thoroughly enjoying the show. He loved watching my own parents tear me down to elevate him. He reached over and placed a reassuring hand on my father, and his shoulder giving it a firm squeeze. "Calvin, do not let her upset you," Trent said, his voice smooth and dripping with fake empathy. "She just does not understand the complexities of the real estate market. She is looking at this emotionally instead of logically." He then turned his gaze to me, his blue eyes cold and calculating. "You really need to learn how the real world works, Maya," he lectured, crossing his arms over his chest. "This is not about sentimentality. It is about capital. Your parents were sitting on a depreciating asset. I am liquidating it for them and turning it into a highly profitable venture. It is a win for everyone involved, except maybe for your fragile ego." I tightened my jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. "You are a fraud, Trent," I said softly. "You talk a big game, but you are just a parasite feeding off my family." Trent laughed, a loud booming sound that filled the tense dining room. "Call me whatever you want, Maya," he replied casually, picking up his wine glass. "At the end of the day, I am the one holding the cards. I am the one with the capital and the resources. I am closing on this property, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop me." He took a slow sip of his red wine, savoring the taste, before setting the glass back down on the table. He looked around the room, making sure he had everyone and their full attention. In fact, Trent continued, a smug grin spreading across his face. "I have the final paperwork sitting right in my briefcase in the hallway. $800,000, Maya. That is the purchase contract I am about to sign with your parents on Monday morning. 800 grand. I bet you have never even seen that kind of money in your entire life. Once that ink dries, this property officially belongs to my firm. And the very first thing I am going to do is serve you with a permanent trespass notice so you can never harass my wife or my in-laws again." I looked at the plates of food scattered across the table. The sweet potato pie that I had baked with so much love was sitting completely untouched. The irony of the situation was almost suffocating. I had spent my entire adult life trying to be the perfect supportive daughter. I had sacrificed my own comfort, my own peace of mind, and thousands of dollars of my own hard-earned money to ensure my parents were taken care of. I had embraced the heavy burden of the black tax, believing that my sacrifices would eventually earn me their respect and unconditional love. Instead, my sacrifices had simply been expected, demanded, and ultimately weaponized against me. My parents did not see me as a successful, independent woman. They saw me as an endless bank for their minor emergencies, but a complete afterthought when it came to major family decisions. They had gladly taken my money to fix the roof over their heads, but they were completely willing to sell that very same roof to a man who treated me like garbage. And they justified this massive betrayal by convincing themselves that my financial contributions were meaningless simply because I did not brag about my wealth the way Trent did. Trent loved the sound of his own voice. He thrived on the worship my parents gave him. He adjusted his expensive watch, making sure the gold caught the light from the dining room chandelier. He was practically vibrating with excitement at the thought of destroying my childhood home and building his sterile duplexes over the memories of my grandfather. $800,000. He repeated the number, rolling off his tongue like a sweet melody. "It is going to be the biggest acquisition my firm has made all year. The bank is completely thrilled with my development proposal. We are going to make an absolute killing on this project, Maya. You should really stick around and watch how a real business operates. You might actually learn something useful for your little bank job." He smiled, showing all of his perfectly whitened teeth. The absolute sheer arrogance radiating from him was almost blinding. He thought he had won. He thought he had completely outsmarted me, isolated me from my family, and secured a massive financial victory at my expense. He believed he was the undisputed king of the castle, holding a signed contract that would grant him ultimate power over our family legacy. The sheer volume of his booming voice mixed with the undeniable hostility radiating from his body was simply too much for a 5-year-old to process. Until now, Zuri had been quietly whimpering, pressing her face into the fabric of my sweater to hide from the tension. But as Trent slammed his hand against the table, the loud, sudden crack caused her to flinch violently. She let out a sharp gasp, and then the dam completely broke. Zuri began to cry out of pure, visceral fear. These were not just the soft sniffles of a tired child. These were deep chest-heaving sobs of a little girl who felt completely unsafe in a house that was supposed to belong to her grandparents. Her wails echoed off the dining room walls, cutting through the suffocating silence of the adults. I immediately dropped down to my knees on the hardwood floor, wrapping both of my arms tightly around her small, trembling body. I buried my face in her soft hair, whispering gentle reassurances into her ear, promising her that Mommy was right here and that no one was going to hurt her. I rocked her back and forth, trying to shield her from the venomous stares of the people sitting just a few feet away. But instead of evoking any sense of empathy or basic human decency, the sound of my crying daughter only seemed to irritate them further. My mother Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rubbed her temples as if the noise was a personal attack against her nervous system. My father Calvin shook his head and picked up his fork, returning to his meal, as if his own granddaughter was nothing more than a stray cat crying outside a window. But it was Trent who reacted the most aggressively. He pinched the bridge of his nose and squeezed his eyes shut, his face contorting into a mask of pure annoyance. He reached out and grabbed his wine glass, taking a massive gulp before slamming it back down onto the table. "Jesus Christ," he groaned, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "Will you make her shut up, Maya? I have had an incredibly long and stressful week closing multi-million-dollar deals and keeping your parents from going completely bankrupt. The very last thing I need right now is to listen to a screaming brat ruin my holiday dinner." I did not even bother looking up at him. I just kept rocking Zuri, rubbing her back in soothing circles. "She is terrified," I said, my voice tight with suppressed rage. "You are screaming and threatening us. She is just a little girl. I do not care what she is," Trent snapped, cutting me off completely. He turned his head and looked directly at his wife. "Vanessa, get rid of them. Kick her out right now. She is giving me a massive headache and I am done dealing with this charity case for the evening." Vanessa did not hesitate for a single second. In fact, she looked absolutely thrilled to be given the official command to dispose of us. She pushed her chair back with a loud scrape and stood up, her eyes gleaming with a sick sense of triumph. She marched past me, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She walked straight into the hallway toward the front entryway, where we had left our belongings when we arrived. I kept my arms securely wrapped around my daughter, refusing to let her see the sheer cruelty playing out in the hallway. I heard the sharp sound of metal hangers scraping against the wooden closet rod. A moment later, Vanessa marched back into the dining room area. In her hand, she held Zuri and her small pink winter coat, the one I had saved up for weeks to buy her so she would be warm enough for the brutal winter snow. Vanessa did not just hand me the coat. She walked past me, completely ignoring my presence, and headed straight for the heavy oak front door of the house. She grabbed the brass handle and yanked the door wide open. A brutal gust of freezing December wind immediately rushed into the warm house. The sudden draft swept through the dining room violently, blowing out the festive red candles sitting in the center of the table and sending a chill straight through my bones. With a vicious flick of her wrist, Vanessa threw the small pink coat out the door. It landed in a crumpled heap on the snow-covered wooden planks of the front porch. She turned around and looked down at me, still kneeling on the floor with my crying child. "Get your things and get out," Vanessa commanded, her voice colder than the winter air blowing through the open door. "Leave and never return. Christmas is so much better without you." The words hung in the freezing air, final and absolute. She stood there holding the door open, pointing out into the dark, snowy night, expecting me to break. She expected me to burst into tears. She expected me to beg my parents to intervene, to plead for just one more chance to stay in the warm house, to apologize for ruining Trent and his special evening. She wanted me to grovel at her feet and humiliate myself just to keep a roof over my daughter and her head for the night. I looked past Vanessa and stared directly at my mother and father. They were sitting at the table in the dim light of the dining room, completely unfazed by what was happening. Brenda was casually picking at her salad, while Calvin was swirling the red wine in his glass. They had watched their eldest daughter throw their 5-year-old granddaughter and her coat out into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve, and they had done absolutely nothing to stop it. They had officially chosen their side. They had chosen the illusion of wealth and the approval of a white savior over their own flesh and blood. In that exact moment, something deep inside of me completely shattered. But it was not my spirit that broke. It was the heavy, invisible chain of the black tax that had bound me to these people for my entire adult life. It was the guilt, the sense of obligation, the desperate lingering hope that if I just loved them enough and sacrificed enough, they would eventually love me back. All of it simply evaporated into the freezing air, leaving behind a hollow space that was quickly filled with something much stronger. The hot, burning rage that had been boiling in my chest for the past hour suddenly went completely cold. It crystallized, turning into an absolute chilling 0-degree calm. My heartbeat slowed down to a steady, powerful rhythm. The tears that had been threatening to spill from my eyes completely dried up. I felt a strange, overwhelming sense of clarity wash over my entire body. I was no longer the desperate daughter seeking approval from a mother who despised me. I was the regional director of forensic accounting. I was a woman who dismantled arrogant corporate criminals for a living. And I was looking right at a man who was stupid enough to hand me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. I did not cry. I did not beg. I did not say a single word of protest. I simply stood up, brushing the invisible dust off the knees of my pants, and gently picked my daughter up into my arms. I walked slowly toward the front door, carrying my daughter. The heavy oak door was still wide open, letting the brutal winter storm blow straight into the hallway. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, but I barely felt the biting cold. All I felt was the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart, echoing in my ears like a war drum. I stepped out onto the snowy wooden porch. The thick white snow was already starting to cover Zuri and her small pink coat that Vanessa had thrown outside like a piece of worthless garbage. I carefully set Zuri down on her feet. She grabbed onto my leg, burying her face into my pants to hide from the howling wind. I bent down and picked up the pink coat from the frozen floorboards. I brushed the white flakes of snow off the fabric, my hands moving with absolute precision and an unnatural calmness. I wrapped the heavy winter coat around her small, trembling shoulders, pushing her tiny arms through the sleeves and zipping it all the way up to her chin to keep the brutal weather out. I pulled the little fur-lined hood over her head, smoothing down her hair. She looked up at me with her big brown eyes still shiny with unshed tears and a look of deep confusion. "We are going to be just fine, baby," I whispered softly, making sure my voice was incredibly steady and deeply reassuring. "Mommy has everything completely under control. Nobody is ever going to treat you like this again." I stood back up and reached for my own dark wool coat hanging on the brass hook in the hallway. I slipped it on, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders, like a heavy suit of armor preparing me for battle. I grabbed my leather purse from the entryway table, making sure my car keys, my wallet, and my secure work phone were safely tucked inside. I was ready to leave. I was fully prepared to walk down those snowy front steps, get into my car, and drive away from these incredibly toxic people forever. I was ready to leave them to their own miserable devices. I placed my bare hand on the freezing cold brass handle of the heavy front door. I looked out into the dark, silent street, watching the snow fall beautifully under the soft, amber glow of the streetlights. This was the exact driveway where my grandfather used to teach me how to ride a bicycle. This was the porch where he used to sit in his old wooden rocking chair and tell me that I was destined for truly great things. My parents and my sister were perfectly willing to let all of those beautiful, irreplaceable memories be completely demolished by a wrecking ball just to line the pockets of an arrogant outsider who despised our family history. I was about to pull the door shut behind me. I was about to let them have their shallow, pathetic victory. But then a sudden, powerful thought struck me, locking my feet firmly in place on the hardwood floor. Why should I be the one running away in the middle of the night? Why should I be the one retreating into the freezing cold while they sat comfortably inside enjoying the expensive holiday feast that I had paid for and cooked with my own two hands? I had spent the last 6 years quietly carrying the heavy financial burdens of this entire family. I had paid the crippling property taxes when they were broke. I had paid the massive emergency repair bills when the roof leaked. I had kept the lights on and the water running while they treated me like an unwanted nuisance. They were literally sitting inside a building that only still existed because of my relentless hard work and my endless personal sacrifices. They did not get to dismiss me like a servant. They did not get to throw my innocent daughter out into the snow and then go right back to drinking their expensive wine and celebrating a completely fraudulent real estate deal. I owed it to my grandfather, and I owed it to myself to show them exactly who they were dealing with before I walked away for good. I took my hand off the brass doorknob. I did not close the door. I left it wide open, letting the freezing winter storm continue to blow violently into the hallway, dropping the temperature of the house rapidly by the second. I turned around, taking slow, highly deliberate steps back into the entryway until I was standing right on the threshold of the formal dining room. My parents and Vanessa and Trent were already trying to return to their normal conversation. My mother was picking up her silver fork, and Trent was reaching for the gravy boat as if they had not just violently kicked a 5-year-old child out of the house on Christmas Eve. But when they heard my heavy, confident footsteps echoing on the floorboards, they all stopped and turned to look at me. Vanessa let out a loud, exasperated groan, throwing her hands up in the air in an exaggerated display of annoyance. "What are you still doing here, Maya?" She snapped, her face twisting with pure irritation. "I told you to get out. We are trying to eat dinner, and you are letting all the freezing cold air into the house. Close the door and leave right now." I ignored her completely. My eyes swept right past my sister and locked directly onto my mother and father. They looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting nervously in their chairs under my cold, unwavering stare. They were expecting me to apologize. They were waiting for me to beg them to let me stay. "Are you absolutely sure you want me to walk out that door?" I asked. My voice was no longer loud or angry or emotional. It was perfectly calm, completely devoid of any hesitation. It was the exact same clinical, chilling voice I used in the boardroom when I was about to dismantle a corrupt corporate executive and present them with a thick folder full of their own financial crimes. My father frowned deeply, clearly confused by my sudden dramatic shift in demeanor. "Maya, do not make this any more difficult than it already is," he warned, his tone thick with condescension. "You ruined the evening. You need to leave so we can finish our business discussions in absolute peace." I tilted my head slightly, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on him. "I just want to be perfectly clear before I leave the premises," I said smoothly, making sure every single syllable landed with absolute precision. "Because if I step through that front door tonight, my name walks out with me." The dining room fell completely silent for a few long, agonizing seconds. The only sound in this house was the howling winter wind blowing fiercely through the open front door and the soft crackle of the fireplace in the living room. My parents exchanged a brief, highly confused glance. They had absolutely no idea what I was talking about or what I was implying. Vanessa looked at me like I had suddenly lost my mind and was speaking in riddles. But Trent just leaned back in his expensive dining chair and let out a loud, incredibly mocking laugh. The sound echoed off the walls, filled with absolute sheer arrogance and unearned confidence. He shook his head, looking at me with deep pity and amusement, as if I were a delusional peasant trying to threaten a powerful king. "Your name." Trent chuckled, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his red wine. He set the crystal glass down on the white tablecloth and rested his arms on the table, looking at me with a sickening smirk that made my blood run completely cold. What legal value does your name have in this house, Maya? You are a glorified bank teller who can barely afford her own groceries. You have absolutely no claim to this property, and you have zero authority here. Now shut the front door on your way out before you freeze us all to death. I let his words hang in the freezing air for a long moment. Trent was looking at me like I was a complete joke, a minor inconvenience standing between him and his massive real estate payday. I slowly pulled my hand away from the freezing brass doorknob. I did not walk out. Instead, I pushed the heavy oak door completely shut. The solid wood slammed into the frame with a loud, heavy thud that echoed violently through the entire house. The sudden absence of the howling winter wind made the silence in the room feel incredibly heavy and suffocating. Zuri stood quietly by the coat rack, watching me with wide, trusting eyes. I gave her a gentle nod, letting her know everything was going exactly according to plan. I turned my back to the front door and walked slowly toward the center of the living room, which was completely open to the formal dining area where they were all sitting. My boots made soft thudding sounds on the hardwood floor as I approached them. I stopped right at the edge of the large Persian rug. I looked directly at Trent. I did not look angry anymore. I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that did not reach my eyes. It was the exact smile I used when I had a corrupt executive completely cornered in an audit room. The name Zuri Holdings, LLC. I said, my voice perfectly level and clear. Have you ever heard of it, Trent? The entire table grew incredibly quiet. Trent stopped swirling the red wine in his crystal glass. His smug grin faltered just a fraction as his brain tried to process the unfamiliar legal term I had just spoken. He blinked twice, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looked over at Vanessa, expecting her to know what I was talking about. But my sister just sat there looking completely bewildered. She shook her head, her blonde extensions shifting over her shoulders. She had absolutely no idea what those words meant. My parents also looked completely lost. Calvin frowned heavily, setting his silver fork down on his china plate. What kind of nonsense are you talking about now, Maya? My father demanded, his tone thick with impatience. Stop stalling and get out of my house before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. I kept my eyes locked onto Trent, refusing to acknowledge my father and his empty threats. I slowly unzipped my leather purse. I reached inside and pulled out my secure work phone. It was a device they had never seen before because I always kept my corporate life completely hidden from them to protect my income. I tapped the dark screen, bringing the device to life. The bright artificial light illuminated my face in the dim living room. I swiped past my security locks and opened my encrypted file manager. You run $1 million real estate development firm, Trent. I continued, my fingers moving rapidly across the smooth glass screen of my phone. You pride yourself on knowing the market. You pride yourself on conducting thorough due diligence before you close a massive real estate transaction. You love to sit at my family table and talk about how smart you are with capital. So I find it incredibly fascinating that you are preparing to sign an $800,000 purchase contract on Monday morning without doing a basic title search on the property you intend to buy. Trent stood up from his chair. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. He crossed his arms over his tailored designer shirt, trying to maintain his posture of absolute authority. But I could see a tiny muscle twitching nervously in his jaw. He was starting to realize that I was not acting like a terrified single mother. I was acting like someone who held all the cards. I ran a title search, he said, his voice slightly defensive but still laced with arrogance. I know exactly who owns this property. Calvin and Brenda have owned this land for 30 years. I have the preliminary paperwork sitting in my briefcase right now. You are just throwing out random corporate jargon to make yourself sound important. It is pathetic, Maya. You are just trying to ruin the holiday because you are jealous of our success. I smiled again. I tapped the screen sharing icon on my phone. I pointed the device directly at the massive 75-inch flat-screen television mounted on the wall, just above the brick fireplace in the living room. Trent had purchased that television for my parents 2 years ago as a flashy display of his supposed wealth. It was the absolute centerpiece of the room. A soft electronic chime echoed through the silent house as my phone successfully connected to the television via the wireless network. The large black screen suddenly flickered to life. The bright white light from the television instantly illuminated the entire living room, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor. Everyone at the dining table physically recoiled from the sudden burst of bright light. Vanessa shielded her eyes with her hand. Calvin and Brenda leaned back in their chairs, staring at the television in absolute shock. I slowly walked over and stood right next to the massive screen. I wanted to make sure they had to look at me while they read the document I was projecting. I looked at the high-resolution scan of the legal property deed, displayed in bright, crisp letters across the 75-inch screen. The official blue seal of the state county clerk was clearly visible in the top right corner, authenticating the document completely. "I suggest you put down your wine glass and step into the living room, Trent," I said, pointing a finger at the bright screen. "Because you are absolutely right about one thing. This house belonged to Calvin and Brenda for many years. But things change when you ignore certified letters from the county tax assessor. Things change when you bury your financial problems in the backyard and pretend everything is fine. You clearly need to update your preliminary paperwork." Trent stared at the television. The absolute sheer confidence that had radiated from him all evening began to completely evaporate. He slowly placed his crystal wine glass down on the table. He stepped away from the dining area and walked slowly into the living room, his expensive suede shoes making absolutely no sound on the thick Persian rug. His eyes were wide, his pupils darting rapidly back and forth as he scanned the dense legal text projected onto the wall. Vanessa quickly followed him, gripping his arm tightly as she stared at the screen. My parents stood up from the table as well, their faces pale with sudden, inexplicable dread. They all gathered in the living room, standing like frozen statues as they read the official document. The document outlined the complete legal history of the property. It showed the original purchase date from 30 years ago. It showed the parcel number, the block number, and the specific lot dimensions. It showed the original mortgage documents that had been filed when my grandfather first transferred the deed to my parents. But most importantly, it showed the current legal deed of trust, clearly stating who held the absolute legal rights to the land and the physical structure sitting on it. I watched Trent as his eyes finally landed on the bold black text at the very bottom of the first page. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands dropped to his sides, completely limp. The document was an official state-registered transfer of deed. The text on the screen was undeniable and permanent. It clearly showed that the legal owner of the house was not Calvin or Brenda. The heavy silence in the living room was absolute. Everyone stared at the bright white screen displaying the legal deed to the property. The text was crystal clear and completely undeniable. The legal owner of the house was not Calvin or Brenda. The registered owner was Zuri Holdings LLC. I stood next to the massive 75-inch television, letting the reality of the situation sink into their minds. I watched my father Calvin open his mouth and close it again like a fish gasping for air. I watched my mother Brenda grip the back of the leather sofa, her knuckles turning completely white. "This house was foreclosed by the bank exactly 4 years ago," I said, my voice ringing loud and clear through the silent room. I made sure every single word carried the heavy weight of the truth they had buried for so long. 4 years ago, while you were hosting lavish holiday parties and pretending to be the perfect affluent family, you defaulted on every single one of your credit cards. You were drowning in massive consumer debt because you could not stop buying expensive luxury items to impress people who did not even care about you. You ignored the multiple warnings from the bank. You ignored the final collection notices. And then the bank officially foreclosed on this house and prepared to evict you. My parents both turned a sickly shade of pale. The blood completely drained from their faces, leaving them looking like terrified ghosts. Calvin took a step back, shaking his head in slow, agonizing disbelief. Brenda raised a trembling hand to her mouth, trying to stifle a small, pathetic gasp. They knew exactly what I was talking about. They remembered the absolute terror of realizing they were about to be thrown out onto the street with nothing. They remembered the deep, crushing shame of losing the only valuable asset my grandfather had ever given them through their own sheer financial incompetence. But instead of admitting your massive failure to the family, you chose to hide it. I continued pacing slowly across the thick Persian rug. You were too proud and too obsessed with your perfect, flawless image to ask for help. The bank was just days away from putting this house up for public auction. Grandfather Theodore and his entire hard-earned legacy was about to be sold off to the highest bidder to cover your reckless shopping habits. So I stepped up. I did what I always do for this family. I fixed the massive, catastrophic problem you created. I used my own hard-earned money to save this property, I declared, pointing a finger directly at the television screen. I took my annual corporate bonuses and my personal savings, and I bought this house back directly from the bank before it could hit the auction block. I paid off your massive debts to clear the title, but I knew if I bought it under my own name, you would never be able to handle the bruising to your incredibly fragile egos. So I formed a private company called Zuri Holdings LLC, and I purchased the property safely through the corporation. The sheer shock on their faces was absolutely priceless. They were completely paralyzed by the sudden violent exposure of their deepest, darkest secret. I let my mother and father live here completely rent-free for 4 entire years, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, unyielding tone. I paid the annual property taxes out of my own pocket. I paid for the expensive roof repairs when it leaked. I paid for the emergency plumbing services. I let you stay in this house and pretend you still owned it solely to save your pathetic pride. I kept your humiliating secret so you could hold your heads high in front of your church friends and your precious golden child. And how exactly did you repay me? I asked, my eyes narrowing as I looked at the two people who were supposed to protect and love me unconditionally. You treated me like absolute garbage. You let Vanessa verbally abuse my innocent daughter over a spilled drink. You let Trent parade around this house like he was the ultimate savior of our family. You allowed him to constantly disrespect me in my own home. And then you had the absolute unmitigated audacity to secretly try and sell a house you do not even own to a man who openly despises our family culture. You tried to sell my property right out from under me so you could run off to a luxury condo in Florida with his fake money. Calvin tried to speak, but his voice was nothing more than a pathetic, dry croak. Maya, please, he stuttered, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. We did not know what else to do. We were so incredibly ashamed, and Trent promised us an easy way out. We thought we could just complete the sale and maybe pay you back a small portion of the money later. We never meant for it to get this far. Brenda was practically hyperventilating. She collapsed heavily onto the leather sofa, unable to support her own weight anymore. Her perfect, pristine image as the righteous matriarch of the family was completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The grand illusion of her wealth and her moral superiority was entirely destroyed in front of everyone. Vanessa stood completely frozen in the middle of the living room. Her mouth was hanging wide open as she stared back and forth between me and our parents. The perfect, flawless narrative she had believed her entire life was completely falling apart right in front of her eyes. Her wealthy, successful parents were actually broke and living entirely off the charity of the sister she constantly belittled. Her entire reality was a carefully constructed lie funded completely by my hard work and silent sacrifice. You do not own this house, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling with absolute disbelief. She looked at our mother, her eyes wide with sudden terrifying realization. You lied to Trent. You told my husband you held the clear legal title to this property. You told him he could knock it down and build his duplex here. Vanessa slowly turned her head to look at her husband. She desperately needed him to step in and fix the situation like he always did. She needed him to use his money and his corporate power to make the nightmare go away. But when she looked at Trent, she realized he was not going to save her. Trent was standing perfectly still in the center of the living room. His expensive designer shoes were firmly rooted to the hardwood floor. The arrogant, superior smirk that had been plastered across his face all evening was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The preliminary $800,000 purchase contract, sitting in his leather briefcase, was completely and utterly worthless. The multi-million-dollar development deal he had been bragging about was entirely dead. Vanessa turned to look at Trent, who was frozen like a statue, completely trapped in a massive, catastrophic failure of his own making. I stepped away from the television screen and walked right up to Trent. He was still staring at the glowing letters like they were written in an alien language. "So, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room, "that magnificent $800,000 purchase contract you have sitting in your expensive leather briefcase right now, the one you were just bragging about at my dinner table, it is just scrap paper. You cannot buy a house from people who do not legally own it." Trent slowly tore his eyes away from the screen and looked at me. The arrogant smirk that had defined his entire personality was completely gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated terror, mixed with a rapidly rising tide of fury. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a pathetic, stammering sound. He looked at Vanessa, who was completely useless in this situation, and then he turned his wild eyes toward my parents. "You lied to me," Trent yelled, his voice cracking horribly. The sudden explosion of sound made everyone jump. He lunged toward my father, pointing a shaking finger directly at Calvin and his face. "You absolute frauds. You sat in my office and looked me right in the eye and told me this property was free and clear. You told me you held the deed. You let me draft the preliminary paperwork and bring my investors into this." Calvin backed up so fast he bumped into the edge of the dining table. "Trent, please calm down," my father pleaded, raising his hands defensively. "We did not know she put it in a holding company. We thought she just paid off the bank and put the title back in our names. We did not understand the legal structure." "You did not understand." Trent screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck were bulging against his tailored collar. "Do you have any idea what you have just done to me? I put my entire professional reputation on the line for this development project. I vouched for you people. I told my partners we had a prime piece of real estate secured for a luxury duplex build, and you do not even own the dirt it sits on." I stood there watching the complete collapse of his white superiority complex. For years, he had treated my family like a charity project. He had acted like the benevolent savior, gracing us with his presence and his supposed wealth. He had mocked my job and my neighborhood and my status as a single mother. He had thrown a $100 bill at me like I was a peasant begging for scraps. And now he was having a total public meltdown in the middle of our living room because he had been completely outsmarted by the very person he considered beneath him. "You should have done your due diligence, Trent," I interjected smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly level to contrast with his absolute hysteria. A real estate professional with $1 million firm should know better than to take the word of two desperate people drowning in debt. "You were so eager to exploit my parents and bulldoze my grandfather and his legacy that you skipped the most basic legal check. You let your greed and your arrogance blind you completely." "Do not you dare lecture me!" Trent roared, whipping around to face me. He took a threatening step forward, but I did not flinch or back away. I stood my ground, looking him dead in the eye. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his designer blazer. "You planned this, Maya. You set this whole thing up just to humiliate me. You kept this a secret so you could ruin my business." "I did not set anything up," I replied coldly. "I bought this house 4 years ago to save my parents from living on the street. You are the one who tried to steal it from me tonight. You are the one who tried to throw my 5-year-old daughter out into the freezing snow. You did this to yourself, Trent. You signed a worthless contract and now you have absolutely nothing to show for it. Trent raised both of his hands and forcefully grabbed his own hair, tugging at the carefully styled strands. He began to pace back and forth across the Persian rug like a caged animal. He was muttering under his breath, stringing together a series of vicious curses that made my mother gasp and cover her mouth in shock. He kicked the heavy oak coffee table, sending a stack of glossy magazines sliding across the glass top and crashing onto the floor. Brenda let out a small whimper, finally realizing that her precious son-in-law was not the perfect gentleman she had always claimed he was. She watched in total horror as the man she had placed on a pedestal above her own daughter completely lost his mind and started trashing her living room. Vanessa tried to approach him, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his arm, but he violently shoved her away. "Do not touch me," Trent hissed, glaring at his wife with absolute disgust. "Your entire family is a bunch of pathetic lying scammers. You dragged me into this mess, Vanessa. You told me this property was a gold mine waiting to be scooped up. You told me your sister was just a stupid bank teller who would not know the difference. You promised me this would be the easiest flip of my career." Vanessa started to cry, real tears finally streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her golden child status meant absolutely nothing now. "Trent, I did not know." She sobbed, her voice high and desperate. "I swear I thought it was theirs to sell. Please, babe, we can fix this. We can find another property. We can just walk away from this one and start over." "Walk away." Trent screamed, the sound tearing from his throat in a ragged, agonizing wail. He stopped pacing and stood frozen in the center of the room, his eyes wide and frantic. "We cannot just walk away, Vanessa. Do you not understand what is happening right now? Our entire lifestyle is a house of cards and it is falling apart." He was completely losing his mind. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, successful businessman had entirely shattered, leaving behind a desperate, terrified man who had clearly played a very dangerous game and lost everything. He looked at the television screen again, reading the name of my holding company over and over, as if hoping the letters would magically rearrange themselves into his own name. But the deed remained exactly as it was, permanent and unchangeable. "I cannot walk away from this property," Trent yelled, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. He grabbed his briefcase from the hallway and threw it onto the floor, the expensive leather scuffing violently against the wood. The heavy brass clasps popped open, spilling a messy pile of folders and confidential financial documents across the rug. "Because I already spent the money," Trent screamed at the top of his lungs, his face twisted in absolute terror. "I used the purchase agreement for this house as collateral. I took it to Apex Bank and I submitted it to secure a massive $2 million commercial loan to save my failing company. If I do not officially own this house by next week, I am going to federal prison." The words federal prison hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. My mother let out a loud, dramatic gasp and clutched the collar of her silk blouse, her eyes wide with absolute horror. My father took another step back, looking at his son-in-law, as if he had just morphed into a terrifying monster right in front of his eyes. Vanessa let out a high-pitched wail, dropping to her knees on the thick Persian rug right next to the scattered files that had spilled from Trent and his leather briefcase. "Federal prison." Vanessa repeated, her voice shaking so violently she could barely form the words. "Trent, what are you talking about? What do you mean you spent the money? We are rich. You told me the company was having its best quarter ever. You just bought me a brand new diamond tennis bracelet last week." Trent looked down at his crying wife with a mixture of absolute pity and deep resentment. "We are not rich, Vanessa," he snapped, his voice laced with bitter exhaustion. "We are millions of dollars in debt. The real estate market shifted 6 months ago, and my biggest investors pulled out. I have been floating cash between different accounts just to keep the lights on and pay the massive mortgage on our house. The diamond bracelet was bought on credit. Everything is built on credit. I am completely bankrupt." The sheer devastation on my sister and her face was almost difficult to watch. The golden child who had spent her entire life defining her self-worth by her material possessions and her wealthy white husband was suddenly realizing that her entire reality was a massive, pathetic lie. She had looked down on me for years, mocking my lifestyle and my choices, while she was entirely financially dependent on a man who was actively committing massive corporate fraud just to maintain a fake image. I stood near the television screen watching the complete destruction of their perfect lives. "You committed mortgage fraud, Trent," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and clinical. "You took a preliminary purchase contract signed by two people who did not legally own the property, and you presented it to a major financial institution as legitimate collateral. You lied on federal loan documents." Trent whipped his head around to face me, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "I did what I had to do," he yelled, taking a heavy step toward me. His hands were balled into tight fists at his sides. "I have employees, Maya. I have a lifestyle to maintain. I needed a massive injection of capital to save my development firm from completely going under. I found a commercial lender willing to give me a $2 million lifeline, but they needed hard physical assets. They needed collateral. So I used this house. I told them I was purchasing it for $800,000, and I leveraged its future appraised value to secure the loan." He was speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to justify his massive criminal actions. He actually believed he was the victim of his own terrible choices. But it does not matter now. Trent continued, his tone suddenly shifting from desperate panic to aggressive manipulation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Because you are going to fix this, Maya. You are the legal owner of Zuri Holdings LLC. You have the absolute authority to transfer the deed. You are going to sign this property over to me right now so I can finalize the loan." I looked at him like he had completely lost his mind. "Are you actually demanding that I give you my grandfather and his house so you can cover up your federal crimes?" I asked, my voice dripping with absolute incredulity. "I am not demanding anything." Trent spat, his face turning red again. "I am telling you what you are going to do to save your family. If that commercial loan falls through, my company collapses, we lose absolutely everything. Vanessa loses her house, your niece and nephew will be out on the street, and I will be thoroughly investigated for wire fraud. Do you really want to be responsible for sending your own brother-in-law to a federal penitentiary and destroying your sister and her life?" My parents suddenly seemed to find their voices again. "Maya, you have to help them," my mother cried out, rushing forward to grab my arm. Her manicured fingers dug painfully into my skin. "You cannot let Trent go to prison. He is family. You have the power to save them. Just sign the papers, Maya. We will figure out a way to pay you back eventually. Just give him the house." My father nodded vigorously, his face pale and sweaty. "Do the right thing," Maya Calvin pleaded. "You have always been the responsible one. You cannot let this family fall apart over a piece of property. Sign the deed over to Trent so he can close the deal and save his business." The absolute sheer audacity of their demands was breathtaking. They had just discovered that their beloved son-in-law was a broke, desperate criminal who had lied to them for years, but they were still blindly taking his side. They were perfectly willing to let me sacrifice the only valuable asset I owned, the home I had purchased with my own hard-earned money, just to save Trent from facing the legal consequences of his own massive fraud. I pulled my arm out of my mother and her frantic grip. I stepped back, creating a physical boundary between myself and their absolute toxic insanity. "I will not sign anything," I stated firmly. "I will not aid and abet a federal crime, and I will certainly not hand over my property to a man who tried to throw my daughter out into the snow just 10 minutes ago." Trent let out a furious, desperate roar. He lunged toward the coffee table and grabbed a thick manila folder that had spilled from his briefcase. He ripped the folder open, pulling out a stack of official-looking financial documents. He shoved the papers directly into my face, his hand shaking violently. "You do not have a choice, Maya," he screamed, his voice breaking under the massive strain of his own panic. You have to sign this deed over to me immediately. I already submitted the final loan application. The senior underwriter already reviewed the preliminary file. It is already completely pre-approved. All they are waiting for is the updated title transfer showing my name on the deed. If I do not provide that clear title by Monday morning, they will flag the file for an internal audit, and I am completely finished. He was panting heavily, staring at me with wild, desperate eyes. He tapped the top page of the document with his finger, completely frantic. "Look at it," he demanded. "Look at the letterhead, Maya. I am not dealing with some small local credit union. I secured this loan through one of the largest commercial lenders in the entire region. You cannot mess around with these people. The application is already in the system at Apex Bank." He stood there breathing hard, holding the fraudulent loan application right in front of my face, expecting me to be completely intimidated by the sheer magnitude of the situation. He expected me to cave under the heavy pressure and sign away my grandfather and his legacy to save him from the wrath of a massive corporate financial entity. I stared at the black and white logo printed at the very top of the document. I read the name printed in bold letters across the official letterhead. Apex Bank. The absolute utter perfection of the universe in that exact moment was simply too much to process. The pure, unadulterated irony of his massive criminal gamble crashing directly into my deeply hidden professional reality was incredibly overwhelming. I looked at Trent and his desperate, sweating face. I looked at my mother and father staring at me with terrified, pleading eyes. I looked at my sister sobbing on the floor, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her fake wealthy life. And then I started to laugh. It did not start as a smile. It started deep in my chest, a low rumbling sound that quickly bubbled up into my throat. Within seconds, I was laughing completely out loud. It was not a happy laugh. It was a dark, heavy, powerful laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of the living room and bounced violently off the walls. I threw my head back and laughed harder than I had laughed in my entire adult life. The sound was incredibly loud and deeply chilling, tearing right through the tense, terrifying atmosphere of the room, sending visible shivers down everyone and their spines. It was the sound of an abused, discarded daughter finally realizing that she held the ultimate absolute power over the very people who had tried to destroy her. My laughter finally began to subside, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake. I wiped a single tear of pure vindication from the corner of my eye. Trent was staring at me, his face a mask of furious confusion. He looked at the fraudulent application in his shaking hand, and then back at me, clearly wondering if the immense stress of the evening had finally caused my mind to completely snap. My parents exchanged deeply worried glances while Vanessa just sat on the floor looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into her house. "Are you completely insane?" Trent yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "What is so funny, Maya? I am telling you that my entire livelihood is on the line. I am telling you that I am facing federal prison and the complete destruction of my development firm, and you are standing there laughing like an absolute lunatic." I took a deep breath, letting the cold winter air that had seeped into the house fill my lungs. I looked at the man who had spent the last 7 years mocking my intelligence and my career. "What a massive, incredible coincidence, Trent," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth conversational tone that commanded the entire room. "For years you have sat at this very dining table and belittled me. You have called me a boring bookkeeper. You have made endless condescending jokes about my little desk job at the local bank branch. You even tried to pay me $100 tonight like I was a desperate servant begging for scraps from your wealthy table." Trent frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He had absolutely no idea where I was going with this. He gripped the loan application tighter, crumpling the edges of the thick paper. "What does your pathetic job have to do with anything?" he snapped, trying to regain his dominant posture but failing miserably. "It has absolutely everything to do with this, Trent," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Because you see, I never actually corrected you or my parents when you made those wildly inaccurate assumptions about my career. I never felt the need to brag about my income or my corporate status because I did not need your validation." But since you are currently holding a massive commercial loan application from my specific employer, I think it is finally time we clear up the massive misunderstanding regarding my professional life. I stopped just a few feet away from him, making sure he could see the absolute clarity and authority in my eyes. Maybe you did not know this, Trent, but my exact corporate title is not bank teller. I am the Regional Director of Forensic Accounting for Apex Bank. The words hung in the freezing air of the living room. Trent froze completely. His eyes widened to an almost comical degree. He looked down at the bold printed logo on the loan application in his hand and then slowly looked back up at me. His brain was desperately trying to process the catastrophic information I had just delivered. I specialize in corporate fraud. Trent. I continued, my voice echoing in the silent room. My entire job, my sole professional purpose, is to dismantle multi-million-dollar financial crimes. I track hidden offshore accounts. I investigate fraudulent collateral claims. I work directly alongside federal investigators to build ironclad cases against arrogant real estate developers who think they can lie to major financial institutions to cover up their massive debts. The blood completely drained from Trent and his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the inevitable impact at the bottom. The arrogant, superior smirk that had defined his entire existence was entirely eradicated. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was completely suffocating on his own massive lies. Vanessa gasped loudly from her place on the floor. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting between me and her terrified husband. My mother. Brenda gripped the back of the sofa, her legs giving out completely as she sank down onto the leather cushions. My father, Calvin, looked like he was about to physically pass out. They were finally realizing that the daughter they had treated like a miserable charity case was actually a powerful corporate executive who held the absolute fate of their beloved golden son-in-law in the palm of her hand. They had worshipped the wrong child and bowed to a complete fraud. And here is the absolute best part of this incredible coincidence, Trent, I said, offering him a cold, merciless smile. You just told me that your massive $2 million commercial loan is completely pre-approved. You said the senior underwriter has already reviewed the preliminary file, and all they are waiting for is the updated title transfer. But you clearly do not understand the internal hierarchical structure of the commercial lending department at our financial institution. Trent started shaking. His entire body was visibly trembling. Small beads of cold sweat began to form on his pale forehead, glistening in the bright light of the massive television screen. He was trapped, and he knew it. Any commercial loan over $1 million does not just get approved by a senior underwriter. I explained, my voice taking on a sharp razor edge. It has to go through a rigorous mandatory final audit to ensure there is absolutely no fraudulent activity involved. And do you know whose desk every single commercial loan over $1 million has to pass for that final absolute approval? Trent swallowed hard, his Adam and his apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He took a tiny step backward, his expensive designer shoes slipping slightly on the scattered paperwork. He looked like he wanted to run out the front door and disappear into the winter storm. It passes my desk, Trent. I whispered the truth, hitting him like a physical blow. I am the final signature. I am the person who approves the release of the massive funds. And I am the person who flags suspicious applications for immediate federal investigation. The absolute sheer horror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He had walked into my house, insulted my child, threatened to demolish my family legacy, and tried to force me to sign away my property to cover up his federal crimes. And he had unknowingly handed his entire fraudulent confession directly to the one person who had the absolute power to send him to prison. I slowly reached my hand into my dark leather purse. I pushed past my wallet and my car keys. My fingers closed around the smooth, cool metal casing of my secure corporate device. I maintained absolute unyielding eye contact with Trent as I slowly pulled my sleek silver work tablet from my bag. The glowing corporate logo was clearly etched onto the back of the device for everyone to see. Trent let out a ragged, desperate breath. He was sweating bullets, staring at the tablet like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner at the base of the silver tablet. The screen immediately lit up, displaying the highly secure encrypted login portal for the Apex Bank Commercial Lending Division. I typed in my complex 12-character administrative password and verified my identity through the rigorous two-factor authentication protocol. The system chimed softly, granting me full, unrestricted access to the internal network. I looked up at Trent, who was now visibly shaking. His hands were trembling so violently he had to drop the fraudulent loan application onto the scattered pile of papers on the floor. He took a stumbling step backward, bumping into the edge of the heavy oak coffee table. "Please, Maya," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the howling winter wind outside. "Do not do this. We can figure something else out. We can cancel the application." I completely ignored his pathetic begging. I tapped the search icon on the main dashboard and typed in the exact legal name of his real estate development firm. The corporate database instantly populated with his complete financial history and his currently pending loan applications. I selected the massive $2 million commercial loan file that he had just submitted the previous week. The entire digital file opened on my screen, displaying hundreds of pages of financial disclosures, tax returns, and asset declarations. I scrolled slowly through the digital document, making sure my family could see exactly what I was looking at. I turned the tablet slightly so the bright glowing screen was visible to everyone in the room. "Let us take a highly detailed look at this incredible multi-million-dollar deal, Trent," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. I scrolled down to the primary collateral section of the application. Right here on page 14, you listed this exact property as your primary physical asset to secure the $2 million loan. You claimed that you had already executed a legally binding purchase agreement for $800,000. But that is not the only massive lie you told the bank, is it, Trent? I scrolled further down the digital page, highlighting a specific block of text with my finger. You also submitted a highly inflated, fraudulent independent appraisal claiming the future value of the completed luxury duplex project would exceed $4 million. You used that completely fabricated future value to convince the senior underwriter that the bank would have plenty of equity to cover the massive commercial loan. You intentionally manipulated the numbers to make your failing company look like a highly profitable enterprise. Trent swallowed hard, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. He looked at Vanessa, hoping she would intervene, but my sister was still sitting on the floor staring at him with a look of absolute disgust and horror. She was finally realizing that the wealthy, successful man she had married was nothing more than a desperate con artist, willing to steal from her own family to cover up his massive, catastrophic failures. My parents were completely silent. The sheer magnitude of the financial crimes being exposed in their living room had entirely paralyzed them. They had spent years treating me like a pathetic financial burden while worshiping a man who was actively committing massive corporate fraud right under their noses. I tapped another section of the digital file, bringing up his personal financial statement. "And it gets even better," I continued, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "You stated on federal documents that your company currently holds over $1 million in liquid cash reserves. But we both know that is a complete lie. You just admitted to my sister that you have been floating cash between different accounts just to pay your residential mortgage and buy her diamond jewelry on credit. You intentionally falsified your bank statements to make it look like you had cash on hand. You lied about your assets, you lied about your collateral, and you lied about your legal ownership of this property." I looked directly into his terrified eyes. "Do you have any idea what the strict legal definition of federal wire fraud is, Trent?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "When you electronically submit fraudulent financial documents to a federally insured banking institution across state lines in an attempt to secure a massive commercial loan, you are committing a major federal crime. It is not a simple misunderstanding. It is not a minor clerical error. It is a deliberate, calculated attempt to defraud a major financial institution out of $2 million. The penalty for committing federal wire fraud is up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary and massive financial restitution that will completely bankrupt whatever is left of your pathetic life. Trent let out a ragged sob, dropping to his knees on the thick Persian rug right next to his crying wife. "Maya, please, I am begging you," he cried, the tears finally streaming down his pale face. "If you flag that application, they will audit my entire company. They will see absolutely everything. They will see all the shifted funds and the fake invoices. I will lose my business. I will go to prison. You cannot do this to your own family. You cannot ruin our lives over a stupid mistake." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, profound sense of closure. "You ruined your own life, Trent," I said simply. "You made the deliberate choice to lie and steal and manipulate. You made the choice to walk into my house and disrespect my child. You made the choice to try and throw us out into the freezing snow to cover up your massive crimes. You do not get to use the word family to shield yourself from the devastating consequences of your own arrogant actions. You are not my family. You are a criminal who tried to steal my grandfather and his legacy." I looked back down at the glowing screen of my secure corporate tablet. I navigated to the final approval dashboard located at the very bottom of the commercial loan file. There was a large green button labeled Approve and Release Funds. Right next to it was a bright red button labeled Flag for Internal Fraud Investigation. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. I raised my finger and pressed the bright red button firmly. The screen immediately flashed with a high-priority confirmation prompt asking me to verify the severe escalation of the corporate file. I typed in my secure administrative credentials one final time and hit Submit. The system chimed loudly, confirming that the massive $2 million loan application had been officially flagged for red-level corporate fraud. The file was instantly locked down and automatically forwarded to the Federal Compliance Division and the Internal Audit Team for immediate, highly aggressive investigation. The digital trap had been completely permanently sprung. There was a heavy, suffocating silence in the living room for about 10 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. We all just waited in the agonizing quiet of the freezing house. And then the sharp, violent buzzing sound shattered the silence. Trent had left his expensive smartphone sitting on the dining room table right next to his discarded wine glass. The device began to vibrate violently against the polished wood, emitting a series of loud, urgent notifications. Trent scrambled to his feet, his expensive clothes wrinkled and covered in dust from the floor. He rushed over to the dining table and grabbed his phone with shaking hands. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror as he read the automated message from the bank, notifying him that all of his corporate and personal financial accounts had been frozen immediately pending a massive federal investigation. Trent stared at the glowing screen of his expensive smartphone for what felt like an eternity. The device slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the polished wood of the dining table, spinning slightly before coming to a complete stop. His knees finally gave out entirely. He stumbled backward, his legs tangling together, and he collapsed heavily into the nearest dining chair, the expensive wood groaning loudly under his sudden dead weight. He brought both of his hands up to his head, gripping his perfectly styled blonde hair, and pulling hard as if physical pain could somehow distract him from the absolute catastrophe of his current reality. The upper-class demeanor he had worn like a protective suit of armor for the past 7 years was completely eradicated. He was no longer the arrogant, wealthy real estate developer looking down on the struggling, working-class single mother. He was just a terrified, broken man waiting for his inevitable doom to arrive. He let out a pathetic, hollow sound that was somewhere between a hysterical laugh and a desperate sob. "Monday morning," he muttered, his voice completely devoid of any life or hope. "They are going to be at my office on Monday morning." The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not waste time when a major financial institution flags a multi-million-dollar commercial loan for red-level corporate fraud. They are going to secure a federal warrant over the weekend, and they are going to kick down the heavy glass doors of my development firm the second the sun comes up. They are going to seize all of the corporate hard drives, freeze all of the remaining offshore assets, and confiscate every single piece of paperwork in the building. Everything is gone. My entire life is completely over. He looked up from his hands, and his wild, bloodshot eyes darted around the freezing room, taking in the absolute destruction of his grand master plan. His gaze bypassed me entirely and locked directly onto the three people sitting frozen in the living room area. His profound terror instantly morphed into a blind, violently destructive rage. He leaped up from the dining chair, kicking it so hard it tipped over backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. "You absolute bastards!" Trent screamed at the top of his lungs, pointing a shaking, furious finger at my parents. "You lied to me. You sat there in your cheap clothes in this decaying house, and you lied right to my face. You told me you owned this property free and clear. You handed me old, useless tax documents and told me you were just struggling with the general upkeep. You promised me this land was yours to sell, and you let me walk directly into a federal trap." My father, Calvin, scrambled backward on the sofa, pressing himself against the wall, as if trying to physically merge with the drywall. "Do not try to put this massive failure on us, Trent." Calvin shouted, his voice trembling with fear and sudden intense defensiveness. "We did not force you to commit federal wire fraud. We did not hold a gun to your head and tell you to take a preliminary unverified contract and lie to a commercial bank. You are supposed to be a highly successful millionaire developer. You should have known better than to risk your entire firm and your freedom on a single unclosed transaction." "I am bankrupt because of you," Trent roared, taking a highly threatening step toward his father-in-law, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I needed this specific collateral to secure the capital injection. If you had just told me the actual truth from the beginning, I could have found another property. I could have found another way out of my financial hole. But you strung me along because you greedily wanted my money. You wanted me to buy you a luxury retirement condo down in Florida while you were secretly living completely off the charity of your bank teller daughter." My mother Brenda let out a loud, dramatic wail, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically stabbed. "How dare you speak to us this way?" she cried, the heavy tears ruining her carefully applied holiday makeup. "We welcomed you into our home with open arms. We treated you exactly like our own flesh and blood son. We elevated you above everyone else in this entire family, and this is the absolute, utter disrespect you show us in return. You are nothing but a common, deceitful criminal trying to blame innocent, hardworking people for your own disgusting, unmanageable greed." Innocent Trent laughed, a harsh barking sound that held absolutely no humor or warmth. "You are the most toxic, deeply manipulative people I have ever met in my entire life. You sold out your own hardworking daughter just to maintain a fake affluent image for your shallow church friends. You are completely pathetic and you deserve to live in the streets." Vanessa, who had been sitting on the floor surrounded by the spilled, fraudulent documents, suddenly scrambled to her feet. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled and her face was red and blotchy from crying so hard. "Do not talk to my parents like that," she shrieked, slapping Trent hard on the shoulder with her open palm. "You are the one who ruined absolutely everything, Trent. You lied to me for months. You told me we were incredibly wealthy. You let me plan expensive international vacations and buy luxury clothes while you were secretly drowning in massive debt and committing serious federal crimes. You made me look like an absolute fool in front of everyone I know." Trent whipped around and glared at his wife with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You are a fool, Vanessa." He spat, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "You contributed absolutely nothing to our marriage except crippling credit card debt and endless materialistic demands. You cared more about the designer brand of your handbag than the actual reality of our bank account. I committed fraud to keep up the pathetic fake lifestyle that you constantly demanded. You are just as guilty as I am." I stood silently near the massive television screen, watching the complete and total implosion of their toxic family dynamic. For my entire life, they had presented a solid, united front against me. They had always agreed that I was the problem, the outcast, the difficult child who never quite measured up to their ridiculous, impossible standards. But the absolute second, the fake money disappeared and the threat of real severe legal consequences emerged, their so-called unwavering loyalty evaporated into thin air. They immediately turned on each other, tearing at each other like a pack of starving wild wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. There was no genuine love here. There was no real family bond. There had only ever been a shallow transaction, and that transaction had just gone completely morally bankrupt. Vanessa stared at Trent, her chest heaving as she finally realized that her husband was completely and utterly useless to her now. He was not a powerful millionaire. He was not a financial savior. He was a convicted felon waiting to happen. The luxury cars would be repossessed by the bank. The massive house would be seized by the federal government. Her perfect, flawless country club life was entirely, permanently over. She would be left with absolutely nothing to her name. Her eyes darted wildly around the freezing room, desperately searching for any possible lifeline. She looked at her parents, but they were just two broke elderly people who did not even legally own the roof over their heads. And then her frantic eyes locked directly onto me. I was standing tall and completely calm in my dark wool coat, holding my highly secure corporate tablet. I was the regional director of forensic accounting. I was the sole legal owner of Zuri Holdings LLC. I was the only person in the room who actually held any real wealth and absolute untouchable power. Vanessa let out a ragged, deeply desperate sob. She abandoned her furious husband, leaving him standing in the middle of his ruined paperwork. She scrambled across the thick Persian rug, moving with a frantic, completely pathetic energy. Before I could even take a single step back, my older sister threw herself onto the hardwood floor at my feet and wrapped both of her arms tightly around my legs. "Maya, please, Vanessa," sobbed, her voice muffled against the heavy dark wool of my winter coat. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to undo what you just did on that tablet. We are family, Maya. We are blood. You cannot do this to your own sister." I looked down at the woman wrapped around my knees. This was the golden child. This was the beautiful, perfect daughter who had spent her entire 36 years on this earth, making sure I knew I was completely inferior. And now she was groveling on the dirty hardwood floor, her expensive designer dress bunched up around her thighs, her blonde extensions messy and tangled, her perfect makeup ruined by streaks of thick black mascara and desperate tears. "I was just joking, Maya." Vanessa cried, her fingers digging frantically into the fabric of my pants. "I did not mean any of the things I said earlier. I was just stressed out. Trent has been under so much pressure and he was taking it out on me, and I took it out on you and Zuri. It was just a stupid joke. Here, look." She scrambled backward, letting go of my legs just long enough to reach out and grab Zuri and her small pink winter coat from where she had thrown it earlier. "Here is her coat," Vanessa pleaded, holding the tiny garment out like it was a peace offering. "Take it off her and come back inside the warm house. Sit back down at the table. We can eat the beautiful dinner you cooked. If Trent goes to federal prison, how will I and the kids survive? We will lose our beautiful house. We will lose absolutely everything. You cannot let my children grow up without their father, Maya. You know how hard it is to raise a child without a man in the house." The absolute sheer audacity of her using my status as a single mother to manipulate me into saving her criminal husband was staggering. I stared down at the small pink coat in her trembling hands. I remembered the vicious flick of her wrist when she threw it out the open door into the freezing winter storm. I remembered the cruel, triumphant look on her face when she ordered me out of my own childhood home. I did not reach down for the coat. I simply adjusted my grip on my secure corporate tablet, holding it safely against my chest. "You want to know how you and your kids will survive, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. "You will survive exactly the way I survived. You will get a job. You will work 50 hours a week. You will learn what it feels like to actually earn your own life instead of leeching off the endless sacrifices of others." "But Maya," she wailed, her face twisting in pure agony. Do you remember what you told me just a few minutes ago, Vanessa? I interrupted, cutting off her pathetic excuses. You told me that I was a miserable person with a pathetic life. You told me that I did not belong at this table anymore. You looked me right in the eye and you told me to pack up my cheap coats and get out. You said that I should leave and never return because Christmas is so much better without me. Vanessa gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The crushing weight of her own cruel words finally hit her, realizing that she had completely permanently sealed her own fate. You were absolutely right about one thing, Vanessa, I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You and that brat will never have the right to step foot on this property again. You are not welcome in my home, so you can keep the coat. Consider it a parting gift. Vanessa let out a devastated, gut-wrenching scream, dropping her face into her hands as she collapsed completely against the floorboards. She finally knew it was completely over. She knew there was absolutely no manipulating her way out of this one. But my parents were not finished yet. They had watched their precious golden child hit rock bottom, and their deeply ingrained instinct to protect her at all costs suddenly overrode their fear of my corporate power. Brenda and Calvin scrambled up from the leather sofa, rushing across the living room to stand over Vanessa and her sobbing form. They did not look at Trent, who was still sitting frozen at the dining table, staring blankly at his dead phone. They looked at me, their faces immediately twisting into identical masks of absolute self-righteous, hypocritical anger. How can you be so incredibly cruel, Maya? My mother, Brenda shouted, pointing an accusing finger directly at my face. You are standing there acting like you are completely innocent, but you are destroying your own family on Christmas Eve. You are holding a petty grudge over a spilled drink and a few careless words, and you are using it to send a man to prison. You are acting like a complete monster, Maya, my father, Calvin added, taking a step forward to physically block my path to the door. You have completely lost your mind with all this corporate power. You are deliberately tearing this family apart just to prove a point. You think you are better than us because you have money and a fancy title, but you are just vindictive and bitter. You are going to fix this right now, Calvin demanded, his voice booming with toxic patriarchal authority. You are going to log back into that machine, and you are going to clear Trent and his name. And then you are going to sign that deed over to the family like you should have done 4 years ago. You will not ever leave this house tonight until you do exactly what you are told to do right now. I stared at my father, watching the thick veins bulge in his neck as he issued his pathetic, toxic demands. He stood there puffing out his chest, trying to use the same heavy patriarchal intimidation he had used to control this family for decades. He actually believed that raising his voice and giving me a direct order would somehow magically erase the massive corporate catastrophe that had just unfolded. He genuinely thought he could bully a regional director of forensic accounting into aiding and abetting a federal crime just because he was my father. Seeing that my father and his aggressive approach was having absolutely no effect on me, my mother decided to completely switch her tactics. The righteous anger vanished from her face, instantly replaced by the familiar manipulative mask of a fragile, helpless victim. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic sob, grabbing a cloth napkin from the table to dab at her completely dry eyes. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out in a pleading, desperate gesture. Maya, please, Brenda cried, her voice trembling with manufactured sorrow. Please forgive your sister and your brother-in-law. You know that God teaches us to forgive those who trespass against us. We are so incredibly sorry for hiding this from you. We were just scared and confused, and we made a terrible mistake. But you are a good Christian woman, Maya. You have a good heart. You have to be the bigger person here and show them mercy. Do not let the devil use you to tear this beautiful family apart. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling a wave of absolute profound disgust wash over my entire body. She was actually trying to weaponize her religion to guilt-trip me into saving a criminal. She was invoking the name of God to protect the very people who had just spent the entire evening verbally abusing my 5-year-old daughter. Do not you dare stand there and preach to me about forgiveness. And God, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that cut through her fake sobbing like a razor blade. Where was your Christian mercy an hour ago, when your golden child was screaming at my terrified daughter? Where was your righteous grace, when Vanessa threw Zuri and her winter coat out into the freezing snow? You sat at that table and watched them treat us like stray dogs, and you did not say a single word. You nodded along while Trent threw money at me like I was a beggar. You only care about forgiveness now because the fake millionaire you worship is about to go to federal prison and your luxury retirement plan is completely dead. Brenda flinched violently, taking a step back as if my words had physically struck her in the face. You are not sorry that you hid the foreclosure from me. I continued, stepping forward and forcing her to look me right in the eyes. You are only sorry that you got caught. You are sorry that the massive web of lies you built to protect your fragile ego has finally collapsed. For my entire life, I have been nothing but a workhorse for this family. I paid your electric bills when they were about to be shut off. I paid your property taxes to keep the city from taking this house. I bought your groceries. I paid for your medical surgeries. I drained my own savings account to keep a roof over your heads. I paid the black tax every single month without ever asking for a simple thank you. I turned my gaze to include my father, who was now completely silent, his face pale and sweating. And how did you repay my endless loyalty? I asked, my voice echoing off the high ceiling of the living room. You treated me like a pathetic burden. You worshipped a white savior who treated our family culture like a joke. You let Vanessa walk all over me because she was pretty and married to a man in a tailored suit. You took the house that I bought with my own hard-earned money, and you tried to secretly sell it to a fraudster who wanted to bulldoze my grandfather and his precious legacy. You literally tried to sell the roof right over my head to fund your own selfish greed. Maya. We did not know. My father tried to interrupt, his voice weak and completely devoid of its former authority. You knew exactly what you were doing, I snapped, cutting him off instantly. You just did not care because you thought I was too weak and too stupid to stop you. You thought I would just sit in the corner and cry while you stripped away everything I had ever worked for. Well, you were wrong. I looked at all four of them, taking in the absolute destruction of the people who had tormented me for decades. Vanessa was still weeping on the floor. Trent was completely catatonic in the dining chair. My parents were broken and exposed. You stand there and accuse me of destroying this family, I said, delivering the final devastating blow to their toxic narrative. Let us be perfectly clear about what happened tonight. I am not destroying this family. Your sickening favoritism, your endless manipulation, and Trent and his insatiable, pathetic greed destroyed it long before I ever sat down at this dinner table tonight. I am just the person who is finally refusing to clean up the mess. The silence that followed my epic monologue was absolute. There were no more excuses. There were no more religious guilt trips or patriarchal demands. They were completely stripped of their power and their lies. They finally understood that the dynamic of this family had been permanently, irrevocably shattered, and I was the one holding the hammer. I took a deep, cleansing breath, letting the heavy, toxic energy of my childhood officially leave my body. I turned my attention back to my older sister, who was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the scattered, fraudulent loan documents. Earlier tonight, Vanessa, I said, speaking with absolute, unyielding authority, you stood by that front door, and you pointed out into the freezing winter storm. You told me to pack up my cheap coats and get out. You looked at me and my crying 5-year-old daughter, and you told us to leave and never return. Vanessa looked up at me, her face twisted in pure agony, hoping for a sliver of mercy that she absolutely did not deserve. Well, Vanessa, I agree with you, I said, offering her a cold, merciless smile. I am leaving. And I am never coming back to this toxic nightmare ever again. But before I walk out that door, I have one final piece of business to conduct with all of you. I stood incredibly tall, pulling my dark wool coat tightly around my shoulders. I looked directly at my mother and father, making sure they heard every single syllable of my final decree. By the way, I announced, my voice ringing with absolute legal authority, as the actual sole homeowner of this property, I am officially giving you verbal notice right now. Mom. Dad and you two have exactly 30 days to clear all of your personal belongings out of my house. A formal legal eviction notice will be delivered by my attorney to this exact address first thing on Monday morning. The entire room erupted in a shockwave of pure visceral horror. Brenda let out a blood-curdling scream, collapsing completely onto the sofa as the reality of her impending homelessness finally hit her. Vanessa began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest and rocking back and forth on the floor. Trent simply stared blankly at the wall, completely broken. But my father Calvin absolutely lost his mind. The ultimate disrespect to his manhood, the realization that his youngest daughter was officially kicking him out of the house he had lived in for 30 years, completely shattered his fragile ego. He let out a furious, animalistic roar. His face turned a dark, violent shade of purple. "You ungrateful little witch!" Calvin screamed, his fists balling up at his sides. He lunged forward, closing the distance between us in two heavy, aggressive strides. He raised his hand, clearly intending to physically strike me, to force me into submission through sheer violence, just like he had done when I was a helpless child. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. Instead, I smoothly reached my left hand into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my personal cell phone. The screen was glowing bright white in the dim room. Displayed prominently on the screen was an active audio recording application. The red timer digits were ticking upward, showing that it had been recording continuously for over 2 hours. I held the glowing screen up, pointing it directly at my father and his furious face. Calvin stopped dead in his tracks. His raised fist froze in midair just inches from my face. His eyes darted from my cold, unblinking stare to the red recording timer on the phone. "I have recorded every single second of this dinner," I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely terrifying. "I have your beloved son-in-law confessing to federal wire fraud. I have you and Mom admitting to a conspiracy to sell property you do not own. And I have you actively threatening to physically assault me right now. If you take one more step toward me, I will send this entire audio file directly to the local police department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation before I even reach my car." Calvin froze completely. His eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my phone. The red numbers of the recording timer kept ticking upward, a digital testament to every single vile thing they had said and done tonight. The absolute rage that had contorted his features slowly melted into a look of profound, defeated terror. He slowly lowered his raised fist, his shoulders sagging, as the reality of his complete powerlessness washed over him. He was a man who had ruled his household through fear and intimidation for decades, but he had absolutely no defense against undeniable digital evidence. I slipped the phone safely back into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat, keeping my hand securely wrapped around it. I did not say another word to him. I did not need to. The ultimate shift in power was complete and undeniable. I turned my back on my father for the very last time and walked across the room to where my daughter was standing. Zuri looked up at me, her large brown eyes completely dry, now filled with a quiet, trusting resilience. I bent down and scooped her up into my arms, resting her head against my shoulder. She wrapped her small arms tightly around my neck, her pink winter coat providing a soft, warm barrier between us. I walked toward the front hallway, leaving the dining room and the living room behind me. As I reached the heavy oak front door, I did not look back. I stepped out onto the snowy porch and pulled the door shut behind me with a firm, decisive click. The moment the lock engaged, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home was instantly severed. The freezing winter wind whipped across my face, but it did not feel bitter or harsh. It felt incredibly clean and purifying. It was the absolute opposite of being kicked out. It was a profound, magnificent liberation. I walked carefully down the snow-covered steps, my boots crunching softly in the fresh white powder. As I made my way down the driveway toward my parked car, the chaotic sounds of the nightmare I had left behind began to bleed through the walls of the house. I could hear the muffled sound of heavy furniture being overturned. I could hear Trent screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with hysterical panic. Then came the sharp, violent sound of breaking glass shattering against the hardwood floor, followed by Vanessa letting out a piercing, devastated shriek. They were literally tearing each other apart, completely consuming themselves in their own toxic greed and massive lies. That chaotic symphony of destruction served as the perfect background music for my newly claimed freedom. I unlocked my car and carefully strapped Zuri into her car seat, making sure she was completely warm and secure. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, turning the heater on high. I sat there for just a moment, gripping the leather steering wheel, looking at the house through the falling snow. For 33 years, I had carried the massive, suffocating weight of their expectations and their financial disasters. But tonight, that heavy iron chain had finally been completely, permanently snapped. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, driving slowly and safely into the beautiful snowy night, leaving them to rot in the absolute hell of their own making. 6 months later, the brutal reality of their actions had entirely caught up with them. The federal government absolutely does not play games when it comes to multi-million-dollar corporate wire fraud. Exactly as I had predicted, the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided Trent and his luxury real estate development firm early that following Monday morning. Dozens of agents swarmed the building in dark jackets, confiscating every single computer, every hard drive, and every filing cabinet in the entire office. The forensic audit revealed a massive, catastrophic web of financial crimes that went far beyond his fraudulent attempt to use my house as collateral. Trent had been operating a highly illegal Ponzi scheme for years, shifting money from new investors to pay off old debts while funding his lavish personal lifestyle. He was officially indicted on 24 counts of federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting a highly publicized criminal trial where he faces a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Vanessa completely lost her mind when the federal agents arrived at her massive suburban mansion to seize the property. She immediately filed for a highly aggressive divorce, hoping to protect herself and secure half of their supposed wealth. But she quickly discovered that there was absolutely no wealth left to divide. Trent had completely hidden the remaining stolen money in complex offshore accounts that the federal government immediately located and permanently froze. Vanessa was left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of terrible press and crippling legal fees. She was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment in a terrible neighborhood, completely relying on food stamps to feed her children. My parents suffered an equally devastating fate. True to my word, my attorney delivered the formal 30-day eviction notice that Monday morning. They tried to fight it in court, but they had absolutely no legal standing and absolutely no money to pay for a defense lawyer. They were officially legally evicted from the house my grandfather built. Because of their terrible credit scores and massive unresolved debt, they could not qualify for a traditional apartment lease. Brenda and Calvin were forced to move into a cramped, poorly maintained Section 8 housing unit on the completely opposite side of the city. Their pristine, flawless image was entirely shattered. Their church friends completely abandoned them once the truth about their financial collapse and Trent and his massive criminal indictment became public knowledge. They have tried to contact me endlessly. My blocked voicemail folder is completely filled with dozens of desperate, pathetic messages. Sometimes Brenda is sobbing uncontrollably, begging me to forgive her and buy them a nicer place to live. Sometimes Calvin is yelling, attempting to use his old broken authority to demand that I rescue them from their miserable poverty. I never listen to the messages for more than a few seconds before permanently deleting them. They are complete strangers to me now. Their suffering is simply the natural, undeniable consequence of their own toxic cruelty and endless manipulation. They made their choices, and now they are forced to live in the miserable reality they completely designed for themselves. While their entire world collapsed into absolute ruin, my life expanded into something incredibly beautiful and profoundly successful. Following the massive exposure of Trent and his complex corporate fraud network, the executive board at Apex Bank was incredibly impressed with my meticulous investigative work and my absolute unwavering dedication to corporate compliance. I was officially promoted to the prestigious position of National Vice President of Forensic Accounting. My salary was essentially tripled, and I was given complete autonomous control over my own massive investigative department. But the greatest success of my life has absolutely nothing to do with my corporate title or my financial wealth. It has everything to do with the incredible, profound peace I have finally found. It is Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the night I walked out of that toxic house. I am not standing in a hot kitchen cooking a massive feast for people who completely despise me. Instead, Zuri and I are spending the holiday at a breathtaking luxury ski resort nestled deep in the snow-covered mountains of Aspen, Colorado. I am sitting on a plush velvet sofa in front of a massive roaring stone fireplace holding a mug of rich hot chocolate. Zuri is sitting on the thick, luxurious rug laughing brightly as she plays a board game with my best friend and my new, incredibly supportive partner. We are surrounded by our chosen family. These are people who love me unconditionally, people who celebrate my success and respect my boundaries. They do not view me as a walking automated teller machine or a workhorse born to carry their burdens. They value me for exactly who I am. Looking back on the nightmare of my past, I realize that the most dangerous, incredibly toxic expectation placed upon us is the concept of the black tax. We are culturally conditioned to believe that sharing blood means we owe our family members our money, our mental health, and our complete submission. We are taught that setting boundaries is a form of betrayal and that suffering in silence is a noble sacrifice. But blood relations should never be used as a weapon for emotional blackmail. You do not owe your life to people who actively disrespect your humanity and threaten your peace. Breaking that massive invisible chain was the hardest and most terrifying thing I have ever done, but it was also the absolute key to my ultimate survival and my current magnificent happiness. Sometimes the absolute best Christmas gift you can ever give yourself is finding the courage to permanently close the door on the toxic people who bring you nothing but pain. You have to be completely willing to walk out into the freezing unknown to protect your own peace and the future of your children. Have you ever had to set ironclad, deeply permanent boundaries with your own family members to protect your mental health and your financial stability? How did you find the strength to finally walk away from the people who completely misunderstood your worth? I would deeply love to hear your personal stories and your experiences in the comments section below. Please do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about breaking toxic generational curses and finding your own incredible, magnificent power. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a beautiful, incredibly peaceful holiday surrounded by the people who truly love and respect you.